He stood in front of her, that sinister grin still spread across his porcelain face. "You know, it's not manners." He tutted as he spoke, approaching her leisurely, as if he had all the time in the world. "To be frowning at the person who's letting you live, princess." He chuckled dryly. "Oh, honey, if I wanted to be annoying, I'd go around stealing every piece of candy from toddlers." He shrugged theatrically. "This is me being nice." He held up a finger, as if he were about to list off an important explanation. "For one, I didn't kidnap you per se." He leaned against a concrete pillar as he spoke, casually flicking off a bit of dust on his purple suit. "Kidnapping usually involves a ransom, and nobody is offering money for you." He chuckled again, the sound almost a purr as he took a step forward, his feet crunching on shattered glass and concrete broken in the warehouse. "I just needed someone to distract bats." He stopped a step in front of her, gently reaching out to brush a strand of her hair away from her face. "And you seemed like the perfect bait." Again he chuckled, his hand slowly trailing down the side of her face to her chin, gripping it in a firm hold, making her look at him. "Or what, princess? You gonna throw a tantrum?" He tilted her head from side to side, inspecting her face as if contemplating a painting. "You sure are a feisty thing," he murmured, gently stroking her cheek with his other hand. Suddenly, Batman's voice cut in from behind them, deep and low with anger. "Release her, Joker." The clown stiffened, a look of surprise flitting across his face as he slowly turned around, still holding her chin forcibly. A growl of annoyance escaped him as he felt the sudden impact of a large body slamming against his back, followed by the sound of the deep voice he'd become too familiar with echoing in the warehouse. "Let her go." Batman's tone was dangerous, with a subtle hint of anger. The grip on her chin dropped as the Joker turned around, his wild eyes narrowing as they landed on Batman. Now, why should I do that, Batsy? He spoke in a sing-songy tone, his lips slowly pulling into a Cheshire cat's grin. You don't want to do this, Joker. Batman's voice was a growl, as if he were talking to a petulant child. His grip on the Joker's shoulder didn't tighten, but it didn't slacken either. Let the girl go, and nobody gets hurt. The Dark Knight's fists clenched, one around the Joker's throat, the other firmly around a batarang. Because, if you don't, I'll make sure you never see the light of day again. Despite the threat that Batman had made, the Joker wasn't fazed in the least. In fact, he chuckled. He knew Batman couldn't kill him. He was too good for that. Now, Batsy. We both know you'd never do that. The ropes are tightly secured around her wrists, the binds rubbing uncomfortably against her skin. The Joker chuckled again, clearly finding her discomfort humorous. Now, Bats, he grunted, his tone slightly strangled due to the grip on his throat. He slowly raised his arms, placing his gloved hands atop Batman's. Do you honestly think those little toys can hurt me? The Joker noticed her struggling against her bonds and smirked, looking back over his shoulder at her for a split second before returning his attention back to Batman. So helpless, like a little damsel in distress. The Joker continued to ignore her, still focused on Batman. Oh, come now, Bats. He tilted his head, leaning as far into Batman's face as his body would allow him to. We both know your threats are empty. Batman narrowed his eyes, his grip on the Joker tightening as he leaned forward, forcing the clown to hunch over against him. Maybe not, he answered lowly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I sure can, Clown Prince.
Man, what the fuck?
Batman ignored the Clown Prince's attempts to rile him up, tightening his grip on his neck. You still never answered my question. For a brief second, the Joker looked almost fearful, his playful facade dropping as the Bat's eyes flashed seriously. The Joker seemed to realize that the joke was up, so to speak. With Batman's patience being at an all-time low, and him clearly not in the mood for games. "Ugh, fine," he exclaimed, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. The Joker chuckled nervously, clearly realizing that his time was up. "You won't kill me," he rasped, his eyes glued to the Dark Knight's angry face. For a moment, it looked like the Bat's face softened. Whether with uncertainty or sadness, it was anyone's guess. He stared at the Joker unblinkingly, his eyes narrowed. "You're right." Batman's knuckles turned white from how tight he clenched his fists, gritting his teeth behind barred lips. "And what makes you so sure?" "I won't." The Joker's eyes finally widened, realizing that this is the one time Batman is at his breaking point. That the one time he finally decided to say, "Sick it," was with him. It made him go pale. "Well, hey, now let's not be hasty."
The fuck?
Batman's lips curled up into a grimace, his dark eyes cold and hard. He had had enough of the Joker's games. "Hasty was all those times you tortured and terrorized my family, killed innocents, toyed with the lives of people just to have some cheap thrill." He drew closer to the Joker, who was trembling slightly now. Never in all their decades of encounters had he seen the clown this scared. Batman's attention was drawn away at the sound of her voice, pausing for a brief moment to glance at her. Almost immediately, his features softened into something calmer at the sight of her bound. The Joker chuckled again, looking back to the Batman with a sly smile. "Ah, does the Bat have a soft spot?" The Joker's eyes widened slightly in mock offense at the way she spoke to him, his mouth opening to throw more witty comebacks, until Batman's hand tightened on his throat again. effectively silencing him. The Joker laughed loudly at her comment, almost enjoying the way she spoke to him. Oh, this one's a spitfire, eh, Bats? He gasped, dramatically feigning a hurt expression. Now, princess, that's not very nice of ya. He drawled out the word nice, practically singing it. He rolled his eyes at her, his voice condescending. Feisty, isn't she? Maybe I made a good choice for bait, eh, Batsy? The Joker's smirk faltered as he watched her shake her head, his ego being bruised. Hey, what was that for? I'm being perfectly charming.
Bruh.
Batman gritted his teeth again, forcing himself to pay attention to the Clown Prince instead of the fact that some girl was tied up and clearly uncomfortable. Enough, Joker, he warned, his voice holding a low growl. The Batman had a visible scowl, clearly annoyed at both the clown and the fact that he had a point. The Joker chuckled again, looking back between them with a smirk. What's the matter? Can't handle a bit of flirting? The Clown Prince of Crime chuckled at her expression, clearly amused at her distress. What? Too much for you to handle, princess? The Joker snickered at her response, clearly finding her flustered expression very funny. My, she does have quite the mouth on her, doesn't she, Bats? The Clown Prince chuckled before dramatically gasping, feigning offense. Oh my, such language. Did your parents not teach you manners, princess? He paused, clearly a little surprised by that revelation, but he quickly recovered, giving one of his signature grins again. Now, how do you know I'm not a teenager myself, He paused for a moment, going strangely silent before breaking into wheezing laughing, almost hysterical in its sound. Oh, I like you, kid. He chuckled breathlessly, a playful gleam in his eyes. You're funny for a brat.
Fuck you.
He suddenly went silent, freezing at her words. Even Batman glanced between them in surprise, although you could tell from the way his grip didn't loosen that he was still focused on him. He leaned in closer to her, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. How old are you exactly?
I'm just stupid.
He stared at her for a long moment, as if sizing her up. He slowly leaned in even closer, his nose nearly touching hers as he muttered in a low and dangerous tone. "A little too young for me, Princess." The clown's jaw dropped, his eyes widening in shock as he took a step back to look her up and down, studying every feature, before looking over at Batman. "Did you know she was underage?" Batman was just as surprised, silently thanking the heavens that he was wearing the cowl, hiding his shocked expression. Instead, his grip loosened, his free hand clenching into a tight fist. "No, I had no idea." The Dark Knight looked equally confused. "I didn't question it," he admitted, his gaze shifting to her, almost in regret, as if now realizing she's a teenager and not a young adult in her 20s, like he had originally believed.
Damn.
Batman shook his head, his eyes still on the clown, studying him in a glare. "Of course not." The Joker sighed again, scratching the back of his head in frustration. "Geez, I'm a criminal, not a pedophile." The Joker rolled his eyes at her, shaking his head before speaking in a tone that seemed almost tired. "Again, criminal, not a sicko." Batman's eyes narrowed further at him before he looked back at her, his features softening again at the sight of her still bound to the chair. "Are you okay?" For the first time, the Joker actually seemed annoyed, his eyes narrowing in anger. "I'm crazy, I'm a villain, but I am not a pedophile." Batman was surprised at his reaction, his anger for a moment replaced with surprise that the clown seemed genuinely upset at the accusation. The Joker turned back to her, crossing his arms in front of his chest. "Believe me, Princess, you are not my type."
Bruh.
The clown seemed genuinely offended at them both now, his shoulders tensed and his fists clenched tightly in a way similar to Batman. "Why, I ought to..." Batman's grip on him tightened again, shutting him up almost immediately.
What the hell?
The Joker was almost pale, his eyes glued to the Batman's face. He visibly swallowed, clearly not wanting to find out how far the Bat was willing to go. Speaking of the Bat, His voice dropped an octave, making both of the other two shiver at the dangerous tone. Apologize to her.
Oh my god.
The Joker's eyes widened again, seeing the look on Batman's face. It was almost animalistic, feral in a way that had even the Joker backing down from him. Okay, let's calm down, he mumbled, his voice slightly nervous as he desperately tried to talk Batman down from tearing his head off his shoulders.
Oof. Damn.
The Joker's eyes went wide again, this time in something similar to fear as he glanced back at the Dark Knight. He was well aware of just how much trouble he was in at this point. Now, Bats, buddy pal, there's no need to. Batman suddenly slammed him against the nearest wall, his anger practically radiating off him.
Ow.
Both the clown and the bat looked over at the sound of footsteps approaching. Commissioner Gordon walked into view shortly later, flanked by GCPD officers. Batman, everything okay, NH? He suddenly froze when his eyes landed on the scene in front of him. The Batman was stood there, pinning a now terrified Joker against a wall. And a young girl was tied to chair, looking unharmed but annoyed and uncomfortable. Gordon stood in the doorway into the warehouse, a tired sigh escaping him at the sight that he was greeted with. The Joker being pinned against the wall by Batman, while a young girl sat in the chair, tied up and clearly not belonging to the clown at all. He slowly made his way over to the two, crossing his arms over his chest as he studied them. Commissioner James Gordon slowly walked into the warehouse, the sound of sirens in the background as patrol cars pulled up outside. His eyes immediately landed on the scene, his eyes widening at the sight of both the girl and Joker. "Bruce?" he called, stepping closer to the trio. In came a panting Gordon, trailed by a few other police officers. "Gordon, we heard a call about the Joker," and he paused when he noticed the scene, his eyes widening in shock. The commissioner took a step forward, his eyes glued onto the scene before him. The Joker stood pinned to the wall by the Batman's large form, both their faces full of anger and annoyance. "Gordon, what in the hell is going on here?" The other officers looked between the Dark Knight, the clown, and the young girl in astonishment, clearly unsure of if they should approach or not. Meanwhile, Gordon took a few steps forwards, stopping in front of the scene with a concerned look on his face. "Gordon, what's going on, Batman?" Gordon noticed her with a frown before motioning for one of the officers to go over and untie her. "Gordon, are you all right, kid?" Gordon glanced back at her, his eyes saddening immediately as he saw her tied to the chair. He silently motioned for one of the other officers, who immediately darted over and began trying to untie her. The officer working on the ropes spoke in a soft tone, as to not overwhelm her. Officer, how long have you been here, kiddo? He looked up at her in surprise, continuing to loosen the ropes. Officer, all night? Gordon heard this, looking back at her in horror. The officer's eyes widened in surprise again, clearly not expecting her to be so young as he worked on the last of the knots. Officer, Jesus Christ!
Oh, no.
The officer nodded, carefully untying the ropes on her wrists as Gordon spoke up. Gordon, are you hurt anywhere, kid? Gordon nodded, his eyes glancing back up to the scene behind him for a moment, silently wondering just how the clown had managed to kidnap her under their noses. Gordon, what's your name, kid? Gordon paused for a brief moment at the unfamiliar name, thinking it over in his head and committing it to memory. Gordon, that's an interesting name. You're not from around here, are you? Gordon smiled gently, his eyes softening at the sight of her. Gordon, that's a nice name. Tell me, why did the Joker target you, Elif? Gordon seemed slightly familiar with the name. He just couldn't put his finger on where he had heard it before. Gordon. Elif, huh? That's a pretty name. What are you doing in Gotham all by yourself? Gordon nodded in acknowledgement, gently patting her head. Gordon, does anyone know where you are? Gordon nodded again, carefully taking in what he knew so far. A young girl, tied to a chair in Crime Alley, all thanks to the Joker. Suddenly, he was reminded of Barbara's own kidnapping by the clown. Gordon, where are your parents, Elif? Gordon smiled softly at her, nodding again as the officer finished untying her. Gordon, okay, Elif. Is it all right if we ask you a few questions? Gordon crouched down to be eye level with her, keeping his tone soft and quiet, as if to not scare her. Gordon, can you tell us what the Joker said before he tied you up? Gordon took a few notes, glancing back at the dark night and the clown prince for a moment, as if confirming the story. He sighed deeply, shaking his head. Gordon, damn clown. He looked back at her, still using the soft tone as he spoke again. Gordon, all right, kiddo, just a few more questions. The commissioner listened intently, his brow furrowing as she relayed what the clown had told her. Once she finished, he nodded, taking a moment to collect the thoughts that raced through his brain. Gordon, and the Batman showed up once the clown had you restrained? Gordon's eyes widened a bit as he listened, his jaw going slack in surprise by how casual the clown had been the entire time. Gordon, and he only tied you up? He didn't do anything else? He seemed to relax a bit, clearly relieved that she wasn't physically harmed by the clown. He sighed, standing back up and turning towards the scene again, silently observing with a concerned expression on his face. Gordon, can you tell me why you were even in here in the first place, kid? Did he kidnap you from your home? The officers and Batman all looked horrified at her response. The realization of just how much danger she'd been in settling in instantly. Jesus Christ. Kid, how old are you? Gordon's eyes widened again, his jaw dropping as a wave of shock hit him. Gordon, Jesus. So you're what? Still in high school? Gordon sighed, his eyebrows furrowed in concern and disbelief as he studied her features again. Gordon, how the hell did he manage to get you of all people? A high schooler? Gordon's expression shifted from horrified to saddened, pity now evident in his eyes. He turned his head to the officers standing behind him. Gordon, get an ambulance over here. The kid's gonna need a checkup. Gordon sighed again, scrubbing a hand over his face. A 16-year-old girl, kidnapped by the Joker. He can't imagine the trauma she'd endured in that place, assuming she wasn't already there for a few hours. Gordon glanced behind him, flinching slightly when he noticed that the clown was still pinned against the wall, Batman's hand on his throat. Gordon, yeah, Bat? You mind taking him away? Batman didn't respond, a low growl escaping through gritted teeth. Something in his expression made it clear that he wanted nothing more than to slam him against the next wall again, or worse, throw him off the nearest cliff. Gordon sighed again, knowing that this wasn't going to be easy. The Batman and Joker were still in the same position as when Gordon had entered, the clown still pinned against a wall with Batman's hand on his throat. Gordon chuckled dryly as he followed her gaze, turning his attention back to them. Gordon, yeah, Batman, you think you can let go of the bastard? Gordon, too, glances back over at them, pausing on the sight of Batman angrily pinning the clown against the wall. He'd never seen the Bat that angry, and he almost felt a pang of sympathy for the clown at the moment. He cleared his throat, attempting to call out to him. Gordon, Batman? Gordon also glanced at the scene, taking notice of the way Batman was practically holding the clown against the wall by the neck. Judging by his expression, the clown had probably said something to set Batman off again, even though he was clearly scared out of his mind. Gordon sighed heavily as he nodded, motioning for the other officers to approach the scene. Gordon, yeah, you're right. Come on, boys, let's get him out of here. The other officers approached as cautiously as possible, watching Batman hold the clown down with nervous eyes. He didn't seem to notice them yet, all his focus remaining on the clown prince of crime against the wall. Gordon spoke up carefully, making sure not to startle the Bat. Gordon, hey Batman, can we take him off your hands? The officers carefully approached the pair, slowly pulling Batman's grip off of the Joker, who was now looking like he could practically piss his pants in fear. He silently watched as the officers pulled him away from the wall, quickly cuffing his wrists behind his back.
Lol. The hell?
Gordon couldn't hold a smile back as the officers dragged the clown past him, clearly enjoying watching the man looking so terrified for a change. Gordon, make sure to drive him to Arkham slowly. Officer, on it, Commissioner. Several of the officers chuckled as well, struggling to hold back amused smiles at seeing the infamous clown practically shaking in fear. They had never seen him look so afraid, and they were definitely going to enjoy it for as long as they could. Batman turned to silently watch as well, his expression unreadable behind the mask. As the officers finished, they began leading the clown out of the room, who glanced back at them both with a glare. Gordon paused, turning to Elif with a soft smile on his face. Gordon, hey kid? The clown looked at her for a brief second, the horror in his eyes replaced by irritation when he saw she was silently laughing at him. He immediately opened his mouth to say something when Gordon grabbed his arm and forced him to turn away from her entirely. Gordon, don't even think about saying anything to her, Joker. The clown's face was pale, his eyes wide and sweat trickling down his forehead. It doesn't take a genius to see that the clown prince of crime was absolutely petrified by the sight of the infamous Bat of Gotham right now.
The
Gordon couldn't help but let out a dry chuckle at the clown's expression. Clearly, he'd never seen Batman that angry before, and being confronted with Gotham's darkest hero looking like he wanted to kill you was probably a nightmare that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The officers finished handcuffing the clown, holding him by each side as they led him out of the warehouse, trying to ignore his occasional mutterings of fear and complaints. Gordon watched as they left, shaking his head before turning back to the kid. Gordon, that's the last we'll be seeing of him for a while. The officers slowly led the clown away, taking him out the door as he shot looks of fear back towards Batman until they were out of sight. Gordon stayed, standing by Elif's side with a concerned look on his face. Gordon, you all right, kid? Gordon nodded in approval as the officers finished binding the clown, grabbing him by the arm and escorting him towards the exit. Gordon, all right, let's get him back to the station. Make sure a cell is prepared for him. Meanwhile, Batman's gaze was still fixated on the empty spot where the clown had stood. Batman took a few steps back, his eyes following the clown as he was pulled away from him by the officers. Watching him carefully, the officers began pulling him out of the room, but before they could leave, the clown piped up almost immediately. But instead of his usual tone, the clown's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. Joker, hey, Gordon? Gordon raised an eyebrow as well, crossing his him arms as he looked at the clown expectantly. Gordon, what is it, Joker? Gordon froze, turning back to glance at the clown. He eyed him cautiously, clearly wary of whatever the clown was about to say. Gordon, what is it, Joker? Gordon paused, turning back towards the clown with a raised eyebrow of his own. Gordon, what is it, clown? Batman had tensed as well, watching as Gordon leaned in a bit closer to the clown, silently waiting for whatever he had to say. Batman suddenly wrapped an arm around her legs, causing her to look up at him in shock as he lifted her up, carefully holding her in his arms. Gordon glanced back at him with a surprised look, clearing his throat before returning his attention to the clown. Gordon, spit it out, Joker. What did you want to say? Gordon's eyebrows raised when he saw Batman scoop her up into his arms, clearly surprised to see him be gentle with someone else, but didn't question it, knowing how protective the Bat is with children. I swear, you always take in strays. The clown's eyes immediately darted back towards Elif with a mix of rage and annoyance. But before he could say anything, Batman suddenly scooped her up into his arms, holding her against his chest like he was trying to shield her from the clown's gaze. Batman silently stepped forward, keeping a protective grip on her. The clown's eyes went wide as he immediately began struggling in the officer's grip, clearly trying to get himself free to get at her. Joker, hey! Hey! Bats! Batman's grip on her was careful, yet firm. Almost immediately, one of his hands came up to rest on the back of her head, silently holding her closer, almost like he was trying to protect her from any harm. Batman instinctively pulled his cape tighter around her, as if the very idea of the clown looking at her any longer just riled him up again. He carefully shifted her in his hold, one hand resting on the small of her back so he could keep her closer to him. Gordon couldn't help but chuckle again at the sight, although his expression quickly turned to concern again once he turned back to the clown. Gordon, well, spit it out. What is it? The clown was clearly mad about Batman holding her, but he quickly tore his gaze away from both of them to look at Gordon again. This time there was something almost sad in his eyes. Joker, can I ask you a question, Jim? The clown's eyes remained glued to how Elif was being held in Batman's arms, almost as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He took a moment to stare in stunned silence, before finally breaking it. Joker, where are you taking her? Batman paused, raising an eyebrow under his cowl at the question. He had been about to turn and leave with Elif in his arms, but had stopped to answer the clown. Batman, that's none of your concern. Gordon raised his eyebrow again, eyeing the clown's expression in bewilderment. Gordon, what do you mean? We're taking her home, obviously. Gordon and Batman both paused, having not expected the question. They both looked back at the clown, Gordon's expression confused while Batman's expression was still stoic as ever. Gordon, why do you care? Batman's grip tightened on her, keeping her held tightly against his chest. He didn't say anything for a moment, silently studying the clown's expression with an unreadable gaze. It was like he was trying to figure out what he was plotting.